Welcome back to the 18th Airborne Corps podcast. This is episode 10 of our series covering Operation Market Garden. This is Matt Visser, co-hosting with Joe Bacino. And today on the show, we have John Greenacre. John Greenacre holds a PhD from the University of Leeds, and he's a retired British Army officer where he served for 24 years. He's now a professor at the University of Suffolk in Ipswich, and he continues to work with tours and developing the future leaders of Allied forces. We're so glad that John is here. John Greenacre, this is our conversation.
Broadcasting from the center of the military universe, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This is the 18th Airborne Corps podcast, the official podcast of America's Contingency Corps.
Welcome. Joe holds a PhD from Leeds, and he's retired after 24 years of service to the British Army. He's an expert on all things market garden. And actually, when we reached out to John, he was in Ardennes helping with some of the staff rides, which he's dedicated some of his time to. So thanks for being on the show.
No trouble, Matt. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So when we look into market garden, obviously there's lots of complexities, but I guess I would just start by what's your take on the British perspective on market garden?
As a whole?
Yeah.
I guess most people who have some knowledge of the operation, who have limited knowledge, will see it, generally speaking, as a heroic failure, particularly because the British tend to have the Arnhem focus and the first British Airborne Division. So I think that's the light that it's still seen in. Bridge Too Far is still is still a big watch for lots of people, and that's where they many of them will get their general information from. And hence that reinforces that that view of the heroic failure. I think people who have studied it a little more, and there's been some changes, and I like to think I'm one of them, see it more as okay, so it didn't achieve its full objectives, but it was more than useful. And it set up British Second Army for operations the following year, once the Ardennes counteroffensive had been squashed. So at some stage, that crossing, particularly over the Wyle, would have had to have been made at some stage. Before the west bank of the Rhine could be cleared. So the fact that it was that crossing was made as part of Market Garden, I certainly see as a massive positive out of the operation.
You said that one of the, and I would agree with you there. One of the key pieces that people pull from is from the movie that was created after Cornelius Rhine's book comes out. I would say that with Market Garden, it's not a well-known battle, and people don't really start beginning to think about it until that book comes out. And I was curious as to, in the environment that we're in now, do you think that there would have been greater accountability to some of the senior officers at the time?
Yeah, I guess so. I think I tend to fly in the face of a reasonable amount of popular opinion, and I don't personally have a very high opinion of Roy Urquhart, the commander of 1st Airborne Division. His actions, particularly once he's on the ground, he seems to have a very split personality when it comes to this operation. So during the planning process, he's willing to accept a large amount of risk leading up to the operation. And I've spoken a lot fairly recently about risk in relation to Market Garden. But once he's on the ground, suddenly he seems very reluctant to accept risk. And I pretty much, I lay some of the, admittedly, a lot of the seeds for Arnhem not being 100% successful or anywhere close. A lot of those seeds are sown before the operation begins. But I would still maintain that the Arnhem part of the operation still stood a reasonable chance of success up until the night of the 17th of September, when Urquhart made the decision to halt the division for the night and then set off again the next morning. And that really is the point at which the chances of success drastically reduce for the Arnhem part of Market Garden. As soon as it starts to get dark and he realizes that certainly part of 1st Parachute Brigade is being held up, 3rd Battalion in the centre and the 1st Battalion on the northern route, he then goes forward to have a look and see what's going on. He meets up with the brigade commander, Brigadier Lathbury, who's with 3rd Battalion. He looks at the situation. They've run into Craft's, Hauptmann Craft's ad hoc blocking line that he's put in with 16th SS training and reserve battalion. And I mean, he's perfectly open about it. He accounts for it in his biography. He doesn't like the way the battle's developing at that point, and he calls it to a halt for the evening, tells 1st and 3rd Battalions to go into defensive positions essentially, and they'll carry on in the morning. Overnight, 9th SS put a much stronger blocking line between the bulk of the division and the bridge at Arnhem. And really at that stage, as I said, by the time they wake up and get moving again on the 18th, the chances of reaching the bridge have drastically reduced. Now, I lay that pretty much the blame for that at Urquhart's door, and yet
so
afterwards, and this is coming back to your original question, and yet in a very roundabout way, and yet he gets getting away with it's the wrong way to put it, but he's not admonished in any way afterwards for what I think is the one decision that really dooms the Arnhem part of the operation.
And I would, I suppose, elevate that probably unpopular opinion, but with another Brit. I would hold Monty accountable. I think that Monty should have been fired. I mean, he openly disregarded American superiors. He disparaged subordinates there. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I have a different opinion. And again, some of it's based on risk. In fact, a fair bit of it is based on decision making and risk. So on the 10th of September, Eisenhower held his conference in Brussels, in which he laid out 3 priorities for immediate operations. And they were in no particular order. That was one of the problems. So he had 3 priorities going forwards. One was to try and push the front line, the British front line, to the east far enough to create a buffer between Antwerp and the German front line. So that really meant pushing the British front line, Second Army's front line, up as far as probably the Meuse or the Mars, the river. Second on his list was to clear the Scheldt estuary to allow the port of Antwerp to be used, which would be a massive boon to Allied logistics at that stage of the war. And his third one on the list was to attempt to seize, if possible, a crossing over the Rhine before winter set in. Now, Montgomery then turned back to Eisenhower and, in true Montgomery style, said, well, I can do all three of those at once for you. And which he attempted to do. Now,
so in his
I've
defense,
got,
there wasn't a prioritization there from Ike.
yeah,
So
absolutely. That's
okay,
exactly what I was just about to say. I lay a bit of the blame at Eisenhower's door for not clearly laying out the priorities at that conference and what order those priorities were in. Now, Eisenhower wasn't particularly fit at that conference. He just had his light plane crash, which and he was in a fair bit of pain, so that may have distracted him. Yeah, but he didn't give Montgomery clear enough direction, and Montgomery decided he could do all three. So one of the things with Market Garden, and Montgomery said this afterwards, when people talk about the split between the broad front campaign plan and the narrow front campaign plan, Montgomery said afterwards there never was a narrow front campaign plan. He was trying to advance the whole of Second Army on a 3-corps frontage, and as he said, you can't call a 3-corps frontage a narrow option. So whereas often in Market Garden, you've obviously got 30-corps trying to race to get to the to try and get to the Rhine crossing and Arnhem. What often gets left out are the 2 corps either side, 12 and 8 corps, and when they are included, they're often portrayed as being flank protection for 30 corps, whereas in fact they are part of that push, that general push to the east. So rather than looking at it as 30 corps pushing forward to the bridge with 2 corps as flank protection, in fact the way it should be looked at is all 3 corps try to push out simultaneously, just that 30 corps has the extra objective of going beyond the Meuse, the Mars, up to the Waal and over the Rhine as well. So that's the first part. Now when that as we all know, when that doesn't work, although so out of the 3, by the end of September, essentially out of Eisenhower's 3 priorities, only one has been achieved, and that is pushing the front line out far enough to create a buffer to the east of Antwerp. At that point, when that hasn't worked, he then does turn around to Montgomery and give clear priorities and say, right, your priority now is to clear the Scheldt and get Antwerp open. So Montgomery has to essentially turn through 180 degrees and face back towards Antwerp and get the Canadian army with lots of attachments through operations Switchback, Vitality and Infatuate to clear out the Scheldt, which is complete by the 1st of November, 2nd of November. And then the Scheldt estuary has to be mine swept, which takes about another 3 weeks. And while that's going on, they're also clearing the Meuse pocket, Operation Aintree. But yeah, coming back to Montgomery being to blame, the thing I will say about Montgomery is we all know that Montgomery was generally, in his style of leadership as an army and an army group commander, he was pretty methodical. He was all about the planning, the preparation. He was all about pre-planned fires, firepower, clearing the way, and that was his general style. Now, for Market Garden, he takes an uncharacteristic degree of risk, and I'm not convinced that either he communicated that down, that the game had changed essentially, or he had changed the game, that he now wanted his subordinate commanders to take risks that normally he wouldn't want them to take. And so I think there are parts of the plan where Montgomery initially sketches it out. He doesn't quite communicate that idea of risk, and when it reaches subordinate commanders, or many of them, particularly the airborne commanders, strangely, they de-risk the plan to a certain extent, and by de-risking it, they make it far more difficult to achieve. So I'll give you an example. in Monty's original plan, we have, you have this phrase, a carpet of airborne troops, and that is literally what Montgomery intended, particularly from the start line, 30 Corps start line up to Eindhoven. He intended it. What he wanted was pretty much a continuous carpet of troops to land. So in the original iteration of the plan, the 101st were allocated 7 small dropping zones between 30 Corps start line and Eindhoven, and I think just beyond Eindhoven, so that they would land all the way along that road and be able to protect that route right the way through, as well as grabbing the the essential crossings like the bridge at Son. Maxwell Taylor, when he looked at the plan, and you can see Maxwell Taylor's point of view as well, he still had in mind what had happened to his division at Normandy, the way it had been scattered, and how difficult it was to command and control, and the losses that he took because his division had been scattered on landing. He looked at Montgomery's plan that had come down through the Airborne Corps, and he didn't like the way that his division was being scattered between Eindhoven and the start of 30 Corps. So he asked permission to change the plan into the way it ended up, with pretty much 1 or 2, fairly concentrated drop zones. Now, when he communicated that plan back to 21st Army Group, and he did go personally to communicate the changes that he wanted. First of all, he wouldn't have spoken to Montgomery, because that's not the way Montgomery worked. Once Montgomery issued his instructions, everything that followed that was detail, and he left that to his chief of staff, essentially. On this occasion, his chief of staff, Freddie de Gangen, wasn't there. He was back in the UK on sick leave. Essentially, he'd been given a nervous breakdown by Montgomery. So he was back in the UK. So the one man that was generally inside Montgomery's mind and might have been able to say to Taylor, no, that's not the intent, we need you to stick to the original plan, wasn't there. And so Maxwell Taylor's modification got put in. To Maxwell Taylor, it looks sensible. It's reduced the risk to his division, but what it's done is increase the risk to the overall operation and what 30 Corps is trying to do.
And this isn't communicated with the sister organizations as part of the operation?
Yeah.
Maxwell Taylor's what would have been a sensible plan. It's not socialized with the others involved, the other allies.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to be. There seems to be a lot of, although in A Bridge Too Far, you see the 3 divisional commanders all sort of together and talking through what they've got to do and back briefing. I think in reality, a lot of this was being done in a pretty stovepipe fashion, and separate planning in the 3 divisions, and the same is true of 82nd. And I'm going to be accused now, and I've bashed into 2 American airborne divisions. The same is true of the 82nd, and Gavin's decision, again, perfectly sensible in his own mind, and when you look at what his division was trying to achieve, of securing the Grosbeak Heights before he then tried to secure the bridge, and so by the time he then goes to, as we all know, by the time he then tries to go and secure the bridge, the parts of 2nd SS Panzer Corps have already grabbed at least the north end of it, and the south end really as well. 30 Corps then have to join in with 82nd to fight their way through and onto that bridge, and just slows them down even more. In my mind, and as you said at the start, I was military and went to our higher staff and command college. If I had looked at the mission I'd been given as Gavin and submitted his plan at staff college, I'm pretty sure it would have had a big red cross through it and sent back, because the really clear main effort is taking the bridge first. And if you have to accept some risk in that the Grosvenor Heights, may become difficult if you haven't got enough manpower to go there. I think Gavin should really go, well, such his life, would take that risk in order to de-risk the overall plan. And in fact, Urquhart then does the same thing, but he doesn't do it until he gets on the ground, when he makes that decision on the first night to halt most of his combat power on its way to the bridge. In that, again, to him, it seemed like a perfectly sensible decision at the time. He's lost control of, or as he sees it, he's lost control of parts of his division. He can't tell what's happening at night. He's got an unexpected enemy in front of him. He doesn't know their strength. He decides to stop, and his communications are really poor. He decides to stop until daylight. Seems eminently sensible, and reduces the risk to what he's trying to achieve at that point in time. But by doing it again, increases the risk to the overall plan. About the only cog in the machine that consistently accepted high risks from the start of the plan and through the execution was 30 Corps and Horrocks, who knew how much risk he was accepting right from the start of having to head down that single road, but knew that that's what was required to achieve the overall plan, and therefore was, otherwise, if Horrocks had done the same thing and sitting back as him, you would think, well, the sensible thing to do here would be to push some infantry down that road first, nice and steady, clear away any anti-tank, any ambush from the sides of the road, and then once that's done, then I can move my armor down. But he knew that wasn't the aim, that speed was of the essence, and so he was willing to take the risk to push armor essentially full pelt down that road, and without the road being secure, paid the consequences for it.
Yeah, and I think one thing on the campaign plan that what I would add, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, but there should never be a plan. And as far as the staff college thing, I mean, Red X, that's why we interpret history and we learn from these mistakes. And staff college is definitely not when you're in the thick of it and in combat. So luckily we have more time while in the schooling, in our military schooling. But so the particular campaign plan, no plan should be so inflexible that it can't be adjusted at the last minute. So with Market Garden, it was hastily developed in less than a week. There were 18 separate plans developed in a span of 40 days that swamped the headquarters staffs. So we've given some criticism to the 82nd, the 101st, to 1st. We haven't talked much about the independent parachute brigade out of the Poles that participated as well. But prior to D-Day, intel began to appear about the possible presence of panzer units around Arnhem. And the Allied staffs are swamped with hastily planning, canceled operations, canceling the operations, and they're unable to respond to new information. And the market portion of the operation was sufficiently rigid in that there was really no way to alter the insertion based on this intel. And a lot of this intel, to add another layer of complexity to the operation, is coming from Dutch townspeople. So this is one of the times where we see in combat that there's also a presence of relying on host nation support and the populations to feed into the overall operational plan.
Yeah, sure. And in fact, this comes back to something we had discussions on last week in the Ardennes on this fairly same subject. There's also a degree, particularly with the British and the information that is coming through about the armored formations, certainly in the Arnhem area. There's a degree of I'm trying to think of the best words to say now. I said them plenty of times last week. There's a degree of the intelligence not fitting the picture that the British wanted, and therefore discarding it to a certain extent, or overlooking it because it's inconvenient to what they're trying to achieve. Now there are other,
Wow.
and you may have already covered this. So there are other problems a lot of that information on the movement of second SS Panzer Corps is coming down through Ultra. Ultra is fairly, we would say, big hand, small map to start with. It's fairly imprecise in the information it provides. It can't be disseminated below army level as with the source attached to it. So for that information to be sent down to corps and divisional level, it has to be attributed to another source. And once you attribute it to another source, it loses a lot of its impact. So the division would receive that bit of information, possibility of armor moving into the area. It's attributed to whatever source it's attributed to. It's one piece of information amongst, a stack of information that they've got, and it doesn't get given the credence that it, that it may have had higher up the chain. There's also a problem with interpretation with Ultra as well. So Bletchley Park, where the Ultra information was decrypted and decoded, their job was to decrypt, decode, and to explain the information then when they hand it back, but not to interpret it. There was no interpretation done by Bletchley Park, by Station X. It was handed over to the intelligence staffs of whichever organization it was being handed over to, for them then to knit together with other pieces of information and then interpret it. And that sometimes didn't happen as well. The air, that again plays a big part in A Bridge Too Far. The air photographs, that's not as straightforward either. There's almost certainly low level oblique photographs like those shown on A Bridge Too Far weren't taken. There's no record of them being taken anywhere. There was some high level two-dimensional aerial photographs taken, which did show little bits of armor here and there, but again the interpretation was, well, that could just be a unit moving through. There's no signs that they're actually based there. It's pretty scant. So what I'm saying is that these bits of intelligence are coming through in such small, isolated chunks. First Airborne Division is so keen to do something, to deploy, having had those previous operations cancelled from underneath them, that if that intelligence doesn't add up to an overwhelming picture, which it's not, then and again this comes down to the risks being taken before the operation. Then First Airborne Division are going to look at it and say, well, that to me that doesn't look like enough for me to put my hand up and say we need to think again about this operation.
And is that a confirmation bias or psychological thing involved here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is. This is the picture that we want. This is the picture that we like. Old men, which is
to be done with the war by Christmas.
Yeah, war over by Christmas. Germans are beaten. Old men on bicycles. That's the picture we want. That's the picture that we'll accept. Anything that comes in that bumps up against that picture or starts to paint a different one gets glossed over, ignored, not given credence, whatever it is. And again, exactly the same thing happens in the Ardennes, again at just before Christmas, where the Allies just don't believe that that the Germans are capable of any sort of large-scale offensive action, and therefore, even though there's lots of information pointing towards it, again, it's quite dislocated, the different bits of information, that it just gets ignored, or it's sometimes blatantly ignored, other times just glossed over because it doesn't fit the picture, or the Allies make what they're seeing fit the picture that they already have in their mind.
Sure.
So in those two respects, Market Garden, the planning for Market Garden, and the few weeks prior to the German counteroffensive and the Battle of the Bulge are quite similar in the way that intelligence is treated in the lead up to both, really.
And in this operation, I mean, you see a lot of the same leaders that were involved with Operation Overlord and the Battle of the Bulge. Do you think egos helped with providing an obstacle in really understanding the environment? One of the observations that I make is that there's weather, geography, and there's different elements that aren't being considered. I mean, the marshy terrain, the geographical imperatives of Antwerp, the Germans' 15th Army's commitment to the Scheldt estuary, the impact of weather on the terrain of the drops. I mean, there's all these different components that almost cloud the judgment that should be incorporated into the context, character, and emotion of the leaders that are involved in informing this plan.
I think that's fair. And I think with Montgomery as well, I think he was probably aware, he'd been given these three, or he'd accepted these three tasks from Eisenhower essentially. And the third one of them, maybe trying to get a bridgehead over the Rhine. I think Montgomery knew, again, from the intelligence he was getting and from the time of year and everything else, that if he was going to achieve that, he had a very, very small window in which to do it. Because at his level, the broader intelligence picture would have shown that the Germans were firming up again, and had begun to reorganize their defense, and therefore, leave it another week or so, or a couple of weeks, and 30 Corps may find it completely impossible to punch through. And also the weather, the amount of daylight for an operation at that reach is also going to deteriorate pretty quickly. So I think particularly on Montgomery's side, he knows he's got a very small window. He's been given that task. He wants to achieve that task. He doesn't really want to go back to Eisenhower and say, "Oh, I don't think we can do this." And he can see the logic in trying to get a bridgehead over the Rhine before Christmas, not then to drive on to Berlin and and finish the war by Christmas, but at least to his thoughts were, well, if we can get over the Rhine now in towards the end of September and hold on to a bridgehead, then we've got that bridgehead ready for when we can go again, in the spring or whenever it is. So he knows he's got that small window, and I think he probably feels almost obliged to at least make an attempt, because his only other recourse is to go back to Eisenhower and say, "No, we can't do this. German defense is now too strong, and the weather and other environmental conditions are against us. So out of your three priorities, we'll have to leave that one." And I think that's why he tried to do all three at once, because he knew that if he cleared the Scheldt first and put the combat power into clearing the Scheldt that it actually required, that would more or less halt Second Army. And by the time he then went back to Second Army, it would be way too late by then to do anything. Maybe even too late to push Second Army's front line out to the east, and certainly too late to try and make this leap across the Rhine. So I think to a certain extent he may have felt slightly hamstrung by the task he'd been given, but I think Montgomery's self-confidence probably would have said to himself, "Yeah, we can do this." Yeah.
And I don't imagine it would have been a favorable discussion had he said, "We can't do this" to Eisenhower.
Yeah.
That's usually not.
Particularly not at that precise time. No, and with everything else that's going on in the margins politically, admittedly, it's a couple more months before that really comes to for, talks about, particularly in the British press, a big campaign going on for a land component commander to be reinstated underneath Eisenhower. And clearly, because it's the British press, they think that person should be Montgomery. So there's lots of
and I think
political...
Montgomery thought that it should have been Montgomery.
Yeah.
Well,
to be fair, he did send later, before during the Battle of the Bulge, or just before it, he did send a letter to Eisenhower saying, my feelings on this, and to be fair to Montgomery as well, part of this was because he could see the amount of strain that Eisenhower was under, trying to essentially command at two levels at once, and he couldn't see why there shouldn't be a land commander. But he did, and whether he actually thought it or not, he did say in a letter that he sent, I don't really care if it's me or Bradley, but but someone, you need a land component commander under you as the campaign commander. Now, clearly, probably when he went back to his caravan at night, he didn't really believe that. He believed it should be him, but he did at least put it on. He did at least put it on paper. So there's a lot going on politically as well. So at that point in mid-September, Montgomery's very aware that him and the British are now definitely the junior partner in what's going on, and the minority. So for him to then be given a task and to turn around and say, "Oh, I don't think I can do it," would have been a tough one for him.
Sure. And I mean, since you mentioned Bradley, he's one that offers that the quote, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics.
Yeah.
This particular mission, not to say that he should have deserved that role if the position was instituted or not, but there are definitely quite a few generals that are relevant during this time advocating there. But for the connection here is the logistical component. It's a single highway, Highway 69. There's 2 lanes, and the marshy terrain has limited supplies, equipment, and forces. So that becomes a constraint within the operation as well. One of the reasons that it's viewed as a failure, not getting to one of the 3 priorities that Eisenhower instituted for Montgomery initially for the operation. And then obviously you have the Rhine, which is a major obstacle as well. As well as the smaller rivers and canals that pose an issue for tactical movement. We don't have the same capabilities that we have now then in Market Garden. And I was curious as to how you see sustainment as becoming a constraint for the operation's success.
Yeah, certainly. It's a major constraint along that highway for 30 Corps, for 30 Corps itself, but also for 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. 1st Airborne Divisions, the bulk of their logistics is coming by road to meet them. So they land with an initial logistic package. Then the sort of the second tier is airdrop and what can be airdropped to them. But the main logistic package is coming up that highway behind 30 Corps. And if 30 Corps can't push through, and clearly the priorities are going to be 30 Corps fighting units at the front, probably their engineering units right behind, their own logistic units then behind them, and then anything else way back beyond that. So 1st Airborne Division's logistic units are going to be a fair way back, and I think some of them didn't even, from memory, some of them didn't even cross the start line, didn't even get across Joe's Bridge. So yeah, there is clearly there's a massive impact on trying to feed logistics to the front end of 30 Corps, but more so then to get the airborne logistics through, in particular to 1st Airborne Division up at Arnhem. So again, that single road is a real constraint, but it comes down to lack of choice. And again, is Montgomery or whoever it is, or Horrocks, is Horrocks either going to turn around to Dempsey turn around to Montgomery, or Montgomery turn around to Eisenhower and say, yeah, we'd love to do that, but there's only a single road and it's really tricky. So we think best we shouldn't attempt it. It's probably not a conversation that any of them want to have. And certainly Horrocks did truly believe that it was possible, and wrote about it a couple of times post-war, that he never had any doubt that A, it would be really difficult, but B, that they would achieve it one way or another.
Well, I really appreciate that. One thing that there wasn't much light shed on it within the book Bridge Too Far or the movie is the Dutch sentiment after the operation. So there's an occupation that occurs for quite some time after the fact, and there's hunger. There's a sense of abandonment from the Allies that have left them, and the Dutch people are left, starving. The Americans and our allies, the Brits, the Poles, we suffer around 17,000 losses, and the record's not necessarily clear on that. We've gotten better at accounting for that, but there's a sense of negativity, but there's a sense of abandonment that's there by the Dutch. And that I don't think that was there necessarily well depicted within the book, but I wanted to hear if the Brits have seen that as something that existed there in Nijmegen afterward as well.
Yeah, but it's interesting. And as you say, in particular Arnhem, and I've been to Arnhem many times, both during the anniversary period, over that weekend, or other times as well, and sure, the people that are around who either remember it themselves or have parents who have told them the stories. That period immediately after the operation was pretty horrendous. Arnhem was forcibly cleared of its civilian population. The Germans went through afterwards, because of the support that the civilian population had given First Airborne. The Germans went through the town and pretty much pushed the population out of the town as punishment. They then had to go and settle wherever they could. A lot of them ended up pretty much in the open on that island between Nijmegen and Arnhem. That winter was particularly bad weather-wise, and there was a lot of starvation, death through starvation, and hence Operation Manna was launched to airdrop food to Dutch civilians during that winter. But on the other hand, in my experience, and I think in most British people's experience, there doesn't seem to have been a great deal, or certainly there's not much documented. There didn't seem to be a great deal of anger directed towards the British who'd been in Arnhem once they'd left. I think the Arnhem population had essentially suffered beside them during the battle, had seen the efforts that the division had gone through to try and stick there and in Oosterbeek, in their pocket at Oosterbeek, and I think when they finally withdrew, it was reasonably obvious to the Dutch as well that that they were at the end of their tether and had to withdraw. So I've not seen a huge amount of evidence immediately post the operation of there being a great deal of anger directed towards towards the British in particular, and certainly today, it's the complete opposite.
Sure.
Yeah, you go to Arnhem, particularly during the anniversary weekend, but in fact, anytime you go, and I've taken groups of British paratroopers back there several times to look at the battlefield, and they're absolutely welcomed with open arms. People will come out and tell, people will come out and tell stories. It's still seen essentially as a sacrifice for the benefit of the Dutch, and the fact that it didn't, work, and the fact that a lot of British soldiers, just talking about Arnhem again, died in the process, is seen more as something heroic and something to remember and aspire to. So, for instance, at Arnhem, every year the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Oosterbeek, which off the top of my head has about 2,500 burials in it, not all from Market Garden, some are from later, but Dutch school children around the Arnhem area, when they get to a certain age, I think sort of 11 or 12, they're each allocated a name of someone who's buried in that cemetery.
Oh, wow.
And they do a bit of research, or they go and they visit, and then on the anniversary weekend, when they hold the service in the cemetery, every single headstone in that cemetery, 2,500 of them, has a Dutch child stood behind each headstone with a bunch of flowers.
What an incredible sight.
Ready to lay them. Yeah, and that happens year after year. So it's being passed on to each generation, and that's the story that's being passed on. These men came to try and liberate us. They died in the process. Okay, so it wasn't successful, and it did terrible things to the town and the people in it. But at least these men, came all this distance, made this effort, and made this sacrifice in order to try and help us, and we should respect and remember that. And that tends to be the feeling that's there, and like I said, is still generated and pushed on today. And I remember being there's a Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery, a smaller one on the Grosbeak Heights as well, and I was there one year and just happened to be walking past, and there was nobody much around, and I went into the cemetery at Grosbeak Heights, and while I was there, a Dutch family came in, parents in their early 30s, I would say, 2 or 3 young children, and they came in with a big bouquet of flowers. They stood by a grave for a while, put the flowers down, and looked around, and then went out. So as they were coming out, I spoke to them and said, "Oh, is there someone significant in the cemetery? Is that why you were here, or whatever?" And they said, "No, we do this every year. Just because it's the right thing to do." So yeah, it's interesting how that, because it would be very easy, to say these men came, our town got smashed up, our population starved, and then they left us here for another whatever it was, 6 months before being liberated again. But
I imagine it took some time to get there. I think that's a beautiful legacy in how they choose to remember the service of our allied forces that fought in Market Garden. I imagine it took some time, some reflection, some healing before we got to where we are now. But I think that it's wonderful that they do what they're doing at the cemetery annually, and that family, that's a beautiful testimony as well. And also that people like yourself are willing to come on and talk to us. I know we asked for 20 minutes, and I want to be respectful of your time as well. But thank you so much for coming onto this show. Thanks for investing in the British paras and all those that you've led in staff rides. Dr. Greenacre, we appreciate you coming on. If there's any lasting thoughts, any words of wisdom that you could share or inspiration related to how we can translate this operation as we move forward, I'd like to give you some space to share that.
Yeah. Okay. I would just say that as someone who's supported staff rides as an academic since I left the army, so for 10 years or more now, Arnhem and Market Garden was the first one that I cut my teeth on. In fact, probably nearly 20 years ago now. And yet, still when I get a chance to look at it again and read a bit again, then new thoughts come up and new ideas develop about it. And there's so much that Market Garden can teach us at all levels, at a campaign planning level. That I've talked a lot about risk, the ideas of risk within a campaign plan, within an operation, multinationality, as we would say, tri-service, inter-service, cooperation, and then right down to the tactical level. There's so much that's good to see down at a tactical level as well, to do with decision making and just good basic infantry tactics as well. So there's a massive amount there to look at. So all I would say really is, if there are people sat out there that think they know all about Market Garden, and I certainly don't classify myself in that category, then it's always worth looking at again, because there's always something new in there, and it's usually pretty instructive as well.
Well, we hope that we did a good job creating space. You're the last installment of the series that we've conducted on Market Garden. You definitely provided a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on. And I think that with our podcast, as much as we'd like to give a comprehensive approach in telling the story, it always leads to additional curiosities. So we look forward to what those are and how we continue to learn from the lessons of Market Garden. Thanks, John, for being on. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Matt. And anytime, happy to come back anytime.
That was my discussion with John Greenacre. That was episode 10. We'll have one final episode where we talk through the lessons learned for Operation Market Garden. That'll be a discussion between Joe Bacino and I. We thank you, our listeners, for your continued following. We hope that you'll subscribe to the podcast, give us a 5-star rating. That helps our listeners have access to the podcast. Thanks for listening to the 18th Airborne Corps podcast. Tune in next time.